Somewhere over the Eastern Front, a Russian air superiority fighter, one of the most capable aircraft Moscow has ever put in the sky, went hunting. It never came home the way it left. The pilot ejected. Ground crews scrambled to find him. And weeks later, in a quiet, understated line during a Senate hearing thousands of miles away, the top general in the entire United States military confirmed what Ukrainian officials had been hinting at for days, without ever quite saying it out loud. A Ukrainian F-16 flying an American-designed jet that has been fighting an uphill battle for legitimacy since the day it arrived on this battlefield had just shot a Russian fighter jet clean out of the sky, in air-to-air combat, for the first time, ever. That sentence alone should stop you and make you lean in a little closer. Not because Ukraine hasn't shot down Russian aircraft before, its ground-based air defenses have been doing exactly that for years, but because this is different. This is a Western fourth-generation fighter, flown by a Ukrainian pilot, finding, targeting, and destroying a Russian jet in the air, using its own onboard systems, in a war where actual dogfights are supposed to be almost impossible. But let's back all the way up, because to understand why this single kill matters as much as it does, you need to understand exactly what kind of aircraft was lost, how it was lost, and why the answer to that second question is quietly terrifying if you're sitting in a briefing room in Moscow right now. The aircraft Ukraine brought down was a Sukhoi Su-35S, NATO reporting name Flanker E, one of Russia's most advanced non-stealth fighters, and for most of this war, one of the aircraft the Kremlin has trusted the most to operate anywhere near the front line. The Su-35 isn't a relic. It's a heavily upgraded, thrust-vectoring, long-range air superiority platform that Russia has used specifically because of its powerful radar and its ability to launch missiles from well outside visual range, exactly the kind of standoff engagement Russian doctrine has leaned on throughout this war to avoid direct dogfighting with Western-supplied jets. Losing one of these aircraft isn't like losing a training jet or an older airframe pulled out of storage. It's losing one of the aircraft Russia has specifically built its air campaign strategy around protecting. Here's where things stand. As of right now, based on the most recent confirmed reporting available, the engagement took place on July 8th over what the Ukrainian Air Force described only as the eastern sector of the front line. At the time, Kyiv confirmed the loss of a Russian Su-35S, but deliberately withheld exactly what had brought it down, a silence that, in hindsight, looks less like uncertainty and more like operational security. Russian pro-war telegram channels, including one with deep, well-documented ties to frontline Russian aerospace forces units, quietly acknowledged the loss within hours, reporting that the pilot had ejected and been successfully rescued. That acknowledgement matters, because it's not coming from Kyiv's messaging apparatus. It's coming from voices that have spent years defending the Kremlin's war effort and have periodically, grudgingly, admitted Russian losses, even when doing so wasn't flattering. For nearly 2 weeks, that's where the story sat. A confirmed Russian loss, an unconfirmed cause. And then, on July 21st, during a hearing before the U.S. Senate Appropriations Committee, General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the most senior military officer in the United States Armed Forces, was asked directly about the state of Ukraine's air war. What he said next didn't sound dramatic in the moment. Generals rarely sound dramatic, but listen to what he actually confirmed. He said that Ukraine had recently achieved its first air-to-air kill, where a Ukrainian F-16 shot down a Russian fighter. He tied it directly to the growth of Ukraine's layered air defense system, built up over years with the support of multiple partner nations, a system that has finally matured enough to create the conditions for Ukrainian combat aircraft to operate offensively rather than purely defensively. Read that again, because it matters. This is the first public on-the-record confirmation from the U.S. military that an American-supplied F-16 flown by a Ukrainian pilot has destroyed a Russian fighter jet in the air. Not a drone, not a cruise missile, a fighter jet in an air-to-air engagement going up against one of Russia's most capable non-stealth platforms and winning. Now, here's the part that most casual observers of this war get completely wrong, and it's worth breaking down properly because it changes how you should picture what actually happened over the Eastern Front that day. This almost certainly did not look anything like the dogfights people imagine from old war movies. Two jets twisting and turning at close range, guns blazing, contrails crossing in the sky. Aerial engagements like that are virtually non-existent over Ukraine, and there's a very specific, very unglamorous reason why. Both sides have built dense, overlapping, layered, surface-to-air missile networks along their respective sides of the front line. Ukraine operates American-made Patriot systems, among others. Russia operates its S-400 Triumph network. Both are lethal to any aircraft, friendly or enemy, that strays too far into contested airspace. That reality has effectively pushed fighter aircraft on both sides back from the line of contact, forcing them to operate at standoff range and engage each other with radar-guided, beyond visual range missiles, rather than closing for a traditional dogfight. Whatever happened on July 8th, it almost certainly involved a Ukrainian F-16 detecting the Su-35 at range, using its radar or off-board targeting data to build a firing solution, and launching a missile from well outside the range where either pilot could have seen the other with the naked eye. It's a far less cinematic picture than Hollywood would give you, and it's also a far more sobering one because it means Ukraine's ability to do this again doesn't depend on luck or a rare close encounter. It depends on a repeatable, technical kill chain that, once proven to work, can be used again. That kill chain is worth understanding in detail because it's the real story here, more than the single aircraft that was lost. Ukraine's F-16 fleet doesn't operate alone, and understanding that is the key to everything that follows. It flies as part of an increasingly sophisticated, layered air defense architecture that has been years in the making, built with direct support from multiple NATO partners. That system includes airborne early warning coverage, allowing controllers to build a real-time picture of enemy aircraft positions well before Ukrainian jets ever need to expose themselves by using their own onboard radar. It includes ground-based radar and missile networks like Patriot, which handle short and medium-range threats and free up fighter aircraft to focus on offensive counter-air missions rather than pure point defense. And it includes the F-16 itself, an aircraft that, whatever debates raged in its early months of Ukrainian service over training pipelines and missile shortages, is now flying with a fuller weapons loadout, including advanced air-to-air missiles capable of exactly the kind of beyond visual range engagement this kill likely represents. Put all three pieces together and you get something Ukraine simply didn't have in the earlier years of this war. The ability to detect a Russian fighter at range, hand off targeting information to an F-16 without that jet needing to fly into contested airspace unsupported, and take the shot from a position of relative safety. General Kane's own words are the clearest confirmation of exactly this shift. He didn't credit the kill to a single lucky pilot or a single lucky missile. He credited it to years of scaling a layered defense system built with the assistance of many partners that has finally matured to the point where Ukrainian fighters can operate offensively rather than purely reactively. That's not a one-off event. That's a capability. And capabilities, once demonstrated, tend to get used again. Now let's talk about the aircraft on the other side of this engagement in more technical detail, because understanding exactly what Russia lost and why it lost it tells you something important about how this war's air campaign is actually being fought right now. The Su-35S carries one of the most powerful radar systems in Russia's non-stealth fighter inventory, giving it detection ranges that, on paper, should allow it to see threats well before most Western fourth-generation jets can see it. It's built around thrust vectoring engines that give it exceptional maneuverability at close range, a feature that matters enormously in a traditional dogfight and matters far less in a beyond visual range missile duel. Russia has used the Su-35 specifically for air superiority and escort missions, protecting strike aircraft and helping maintain whatever contested airspace Russia still holds along sections of the front. Losing one to an F-16, an aircraft that Russian state media spent years publicly dismissing as an outdated, overhyped Western export unsuited to modern combat, isn't just a battlefield loss. It's a direct public rebuttal of that dismissal, delivered in the most concrete way possible. Wreckage on the ground and a pilot who had to eject to survive. Now let's talk about the operational numbers, because they matter for understanding where this capability is headed. Ukraine's F-16 fleet has grown steadily since the aircraft first arrived in Ukrainian service in 2024, and current estimates put Ukraine on track to eventually operate somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 F-16s as deliveries from multiple donor nations continue. These aircraft aren't limited to air-to-air missions either. They're being used to intercept incoming missiles and drones, protecting Ukrainian cities and infrastructure from Russia's ongoing long-range strike campaign, while also flying precision strike missions against ground targets using a range of Western-supplied guided munitions, including laser-guided bombs and JDAM kits in multiple sizes, with longer-range standoff weapons also entering the mix as deliveries continue. Ukraine has also been working to expand the F-16's air-to-air missile inventory further, including integrating additional short-range missile types to complement the beyond visual range weapons already in service. None of that expansion happens overnight, and none of it happened without real growing pains. Ukraine's F-16 fleet went through a well-documented period earlier this year where a shortage of American-made air-to-air missiles limited exactly the kind of offensive counter-air mission this July 8th engagement represents. The fact that Ukraine was able to execute this kill despite that earlier bottleneck tells you the supply chain issues, whatever their current state, haven't been severe enough to prevent Ukraine's Air Force from actually using the capability it's spent years building. And Ukraine isn't stopping at the F-16. In a separate but directly related development, French President Emmanuel Macron announced in mid-July that Ukraine is set to receive 16 Rafale fighter jets from France, alongside a range of additional weapon systems, as part of an expanding effort by European partners to diversify and reinforce Ukraine's fighter fleet beyond its current F-16 and older Soviet-era aircraft. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky confirmed that pilot and maintenance crew training for the Rafale will begin in France later this year, with the first 4 aircraft expected to be delivered to Ukrainian forces once that training is complete. That's a significant expansion of Ukraine's available fighter platforms, and it matters directly in the context of this story, because it signals that whatever capability just took down a Russian Su-35 over the Eastern Front isn't going to remain limited to a single aircraft type. It's going to be distributed across a growing, increasingly capable multinational fleet. It's worth stepping back even further to understand just how hard-won this moment actually is for Ukraine's Air Force. When the first F-16s arrived in Ukrainian service in 2024, donated and transferred through a coalition of NATO partners, after years of diplomatic wrangling over whether the West would even agree to send fourth-generation Western fighters into this war at all, the aircraft was treated by plenty of skeptics, including prominent voices in Russian state media, as more of a political symbol than a genuine battlefield asset. The early months of F-16 operations in Ukraine were rocky by any honest account. Pilots needed extensive retraining to transition from Soviet-era MiG and Sukhoi airframes to an entirely different avionics suite and weapon system. Maintenance crews needed to build entirely new supply chains and technical expertise from scratch under wartime conditions. And for a period earlier this year, Ukraine's F-16 fleet was reportedly flying without a full stock of the American-made air-to-air missiles the aircraft needed to fully exploit its beyond visual range strike capability, a bottleneck that limited exactly the kind of offensive counter-air mission that eventually produced this July 8th kill. Every one of those early struggles fed a steady stream of skepticism about whether the F-16 would ever meaningfully change the character of the air war over Ukraine. This engagement is the clearest possible answer to that skepticism, delivered not by Ukrainian officials with an obvious interest in promoting their own air force, but by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States, testifying under oath before Congress. It's also worth understanding this kill in the context of Russia's broader aircraft losses over the full course of this war, because a single Su-35 doesn't exist in isolation. Independent open-source trackers monitoring confirmed Russian aircraft losses throughout the conflict have documented a steady attrition of fighters, bombers, and helicopters, some to Ukrainian air defense missiles, some to drone strikes on airfields deep inside Russian territory, and now, with this confirmed engagement, some to direct air-to-air combat with Western fighters. Ukrainian drones have previously reached and damaged Russian aircraft on the ground at bases far from the front line, including strikes that damaged Su-57 airframes at facilities in the Urals region, a campaign that directly shaped Russia's decision to keep its most advanced stealth fighter away from missions over Ukrainian airspace in the first place. That drone campaign and this new confirmed air-to-air kill are, in a sense, two sides of the same broader story. A Ukrainian military that has spent years finding increasingly creative and increasingly effective ways to reach Russian air power, whether that air power is sitting exposed on a runway or flying at altitude over the front line. The international reaction to this confirmed kill has been notable, mostly for what it signals about the broader debate over continued Western support for Ukraine's Air Force. General Kane's testimony came during a Senate Appropriations Committee hearing focused specifically on continued funding and equipment transfers, and his decision to highlight this kill in that specific setting wasn't incidental. Citing a concrete, verified combat success is exactly the kind of evidence that shifts contentious funding debates, offering skeptical lawmakers proof that years of investment in Ukraine's layered air defense system and its F-16 transition are producing tangible battlefield results rather than simply consuming resources without a clear return. That's precisely why the timing and framing of Kane's remarks matter as much as the underlying military fact itself. Coming at the exact moment Congress is weighing further support, a single, well-documented kill becomes a data point in a much larger political argument about whether continued investment in Ukraine's fighter fleet and the expensive missiles and training pipelines that go with it is actually paying off. There's also a quieter implication buried in how carefully both Kyiv and Washington handled the disclosure of this kill, worth pulling apart on its own. Ukraine deliberately withheld the specific cause of the July 8th loss for nearly 2 weeks, even while confirming the aircraft itself had gone down. That kind of operational silence is a choice, not an oversight, and it typically reflects a desire to protect the details of a newly proven tactic. The specific missile employed, the targeting method used, the altitude and range at which the engagement occurred, from Russian analysts who would otherwise use that information to adjust their own tactics and defensive countermeasures. Only once the United States chose to confirm the broader fact of the kill publicly, through congressional testimony rather than a Ukrainian press release, did the full picture become part of the public record? That sequencing itself tells you Ukraine and its Western partners are treating this capability as something worth protecting operationally, not just something worth celebrating publicly, which is itself a strong signal that they expect to use it again. Now here's where three separate developments are converging at the same moment, and it's worth pulling them apart individually before putting them back together, because together they paint a picture that should worry Russian air planners far more than the loss of a single Su-35 on its own. The first is the demonstrated kill chain itself, proven and now on the record. Ukraine has now proven publicly and on the record that its layered air defense network can successfully cue a Western fighter onto a Russian aircraft and complete a beyond visual range kill. That's not theoretical anymore. It happened, it was confirmed by the most senior general in the US military, and it establishes a template that Ukrainian pilots and controllers can now train toward repeating. The second is the expanding fleet behind that kill chain, which is only going to keep growing in the months ahead. 100 F-16s eventually in Ukrainian service, plus 16 incoming Rafale jets from France, plus whatever additional munitions and missile types continue arriving from partner nations, means the platform available to execute this kind of engagement is only going to become more numerous and more capable over the coming months, not less. The third, and this is the one that should worry Moscow the most, is what's happening on the Russian side of the ledger at almost exactly the same time, entirely independent of anything Ukraine did. Just 2 weeks after the Su-35 was lost over the Eastern Front, a second Russian military aircraft went down, this time nowhere near Ukraine at all, but in the skies directly over Moscow itself. On July 23rd, a Russian military jet crashed during takeoff in the Moscow region near the town of Zvenigorod, not far from Kubinka Air Base, home to some of Russia's most elite pilots and its famous military aerobatic display teams. The Russian Ministry of Defense confirmed the crash in brief, clinical language, stating that a training and combat aircraft had gone down, that the pilot had ejected safely, and that there was no damage on the ground. Officially, Moscow has attributed the crash to a preliminary technical malfunction and declined to publicly identify the aircraft type. But Russian media outlets, including the well-sourced newspaper Kommersant, quickly identified the aircraft as a Su-57 Felon, Russia's only operational fifth-generation stealth fighter, one of the most closely guarded and heavily promoted assets in the entire Russian arsenal. If that identification holds up, and multiple independent Russian and Ukrainian outlets have converged on the same conclusion even without an official confirmation from the Kremlin, it would mark only the second reported crash of the Su-57 program since it began flight testing, following an earlier crash during a 2019 test flight, with some trackers counting a third loss overall once an even earlier prototype crash is included. For a program that Russia has spent years promoting internationally as a flagship export product, championed publicly by figures including Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov and Russia's industry minister, losing one of an estimated fleet of roughly 20 operational felons during a routine training flight near the capital is not a small embarrassment. It's a direct hit to the credibility of the one aircraft Russia has held up as proof that its aerospace industry can still compete at the cutting edge. And here's the detail that turns an embarrassing accident into something closer to a structural indictment. Russian military bloggers, including sources with direct ties to frontline units and a track record of periodically admitting uncomfortable truths, even when it angers the Kremlin, immediately began raising pointed questions about Moscow's own air defense network. One prominent blogger specifically called out the BARS Moscow Air Defense Unit, a network of both formal air defense assets and hired civilian volunteer groups using man-portable systems to intercept low-flying drone threats around the capital, suggesting the Su-57 may not have been lost to mechanical failure at all, but to friendly fire from Russia's own defenses. If that theory holds up under further investigation, it would mean Russia became the first country in the world to shoot down its own fifth-generation stealth fighter, using its own air defense network, over its own capital city, during a routine training flight. This isn't the first time poor coordination between Russian aviation and Russian air defense has cost Moscow an aircraft. That pattern has repeated itself multiple times throughout this war, and it points to a deeper structural problem than any single accident can explain on its own. After years of sustained conflict, expanded conscription, wartime production pressure, and repeated personnel turnover across both flight crews and ground-based air defense operators, the coordination and deconfliction procedures that are supposed to prevent exactly this kind of friendly fire incident appear to be breaking down in ways that go well beyond bad luck. There's also a broader pattern worth noting about how Russia has actually been using its Su-57 fleet throughout this war, because it undercuts the aircraft's own marketing in a different way. Rather than flying the Felon into contested airspace near the front line, where it might actually face off against Ukrainian fighters and prove its stealth capabilities under real combat conditions, Russia has instead used the Su-57 primarily for long-range standoff strikes, launching Kh-59 and Kh-69 cruise missiles from well inside its own airspace, far from any direct threat. That caution intensified further after Ukrainian drone strikes managed to reach and damage multiple Su-57s on the ground at Russian air bases earlier in the war, prompting Moscow to pull the aircraft even further back from any exposure. In other words, Russia's most advanced fighter jet, the one aircraft specifically designed to contest the skies against exactly the kind of Western fighters Ukraine now operates, has spent most of this war deliberately avoiding the airspace where that contest would actually happen. Put those three tracks together, the proven Ukrainian kill chain, the expanding Western fighter fleet backing it, and Russia's own aircraft losses mounting even in its own backyard through what increasingly looks like internal coordination failure, and you get a picture considerably more damaging to Russian air power than any single headline captures on its own. It's not just that Ukraine shot down a Su-35 in air-to-air combat for the first time. It's that this happened during the same stretch of weeks when Russia's own showcase stealth fighter was potentially destroyed by its own defenses, near its own capital, on a routine flight that should have carried zero combat risk at all. The stakes around the Su-57 specifically go beyond this single incident too, and they're worth understanding on their own terms. Russia has spent years positioning the Felon as a flagship export product, one of the clearest signals it can offer to potential international buyers that its aerospace industry remains capable of producing genuinely cutting-edge combat aircraft despite years of sanctions, supply chain disruption, and the diversion of industrial capacity towards sustaining the war in Ukraine. Senior figures across the Russian government and its state-owned aerospace conglomerate have publicly championed the aircraft in exactly that role, courting potential buyers who might otherwise look toward Western or Chinese alternatives. A program built around roughly 20 operational airframes losing one, potentially to its own side's air defenses, in the skies over its own capital rather than in combat, is a considerably harder story for Russian officials to spin into a sales pitch than almost any other kind of setback the program could have suffered. It undercuts the exact narrative Moscow has been trying to build around the aircraft for years, that the Su-57 represents a mature, reliable, combat-proven platform ready for serious international customers, rather than a limited production program still working through the kind of basic safety and coordination failures that shouldn't be happening on a routine training flight this many years into service. There's also a pattern worth noting in how quickly this story moved from initial online speculation to something resembling consensus, even without full official confirmation. Within hours of the crash, independent open-source analysts, Ukrainian monitoring accounts, and Russian military bloggers with genuine frontline access had converged on largely the same account: an aircraft down near Zvenigorod, a pilot who ejected safely, and mounting circumstantial evidence pointing toward the Su-57 specifically, based on flight paths, the proximity to Kubinka, and sourcing from journalists with a track record of accurate reporting on Russian military affairs. That kind of rapid, cross-referenced convergence, built almost entirely from open-source tracking rather than official disclosure, has become one of the defining features of how this entire war gets documented in near real time, whether the story favors Ukraine or, as in this case, exposes an uncomfortable failure inside Russia's own defenses. Taken together, both stories point toward the same underlying conclusion about where control of the skies over this war is actually trending. It's not a single dramatic turning point. It's an accumulation of smaller, harder to dismiss data points, a proven Ukrainian kill chain, a growing Western fighter fleet feeding that kill chain, and a Russian Air Force that, even away from the front line entirely, appears increasingly prone to costly, self-inflicted failures that no amount of official minimization can fully paper over. The Russian Ministry of Defense's language around both incidents has followed a familiar script: minimize, decline to confirm specifics, attribute losses to technical causes rather than combat or internal failure, and let state-aligned media manage the narrative from there. That's a deliberate institutional choice, not an accident. And it reflects an awareness inside the Kremlin that admitting the full scope of these losses, a proven Western fighter kill in air-to-air combat, and a possible friendly fire loss of the nation's flagship stealth fighter within the same fortnight, carries real reputational risk both domestically and for Russia's ongoing efforts to sell the Su-57 to international buyers. The gap between what Russian military bloggers with frontline access are willing to say and what the Ministry of Defense is willing to officially confirm is itself informative. It suggests the people closest to the actual operational picture understand the severity of what's happening far better than the sanitized public messaging coming out of Moscow lets on. So what's the honest strategic assessment here, stripped of both the triumphant framing coming out of Kiev and the minimized framing coming out of Moscow? Ukraine has demonstrated for the first time, and under conditions that are fully repeatable, that its Air Force can now conduct successful offensive counter-air operations against Russian fighters using Western jets integrated into a mature, layered defense network. That capability is going to grow, not shrink, as F-16 deliveries continue, as the Rafale fleet comes online later this year, and as Ukrainian pilots gain more real combat experience executing exactly this kind of beyond visual range engagement. Russia, meanwhile, is dealing with mounting evidence of internal coordination failures, serious enough to potentially cost it one of its most valuable and limited aircraft through friendly fire, in its own capital region, entirely independent of anything Ukraine's Air Force did. Neither of these developments alone would necessarily reshape the broader war. Together, they suggest a trajectory where Ukrainian air capability is trending upward, while Russian air capability, at least in terms of institutional reliability and internal coordination, is showing real cracks. There's a structural risk worth naming directly here, because it's the variable that should matter most to anyone trying to understand where this goes next. If Ukraine's kill chain really is as repeatable as this engagement suggests, Russia faces an uncomfortable choice with no good options. It can continue flying manned fighters near the front line and accept a rising risk of further losses to an air defense and fighter network that has just proven it can find, target, and destroy Russian aircraft at range. Or it can pull its remaining advanced fighters back even further from contested airspace, following the same cautious pattern already adopted with the Su-57, effectively ceding more of the sky to Ukrainian aircraft by default, rather than through direct defeat. Either path represents a meaningful shift in how this air war has been fought for years, and either path plays directly into the hands of a Ukrainian Air Force that has spent this entire war fighting for exactly the kind of legitimacy and operational space that a single confirmed kill, verified by America's top general, just handed it in the most public way possible. And that brings us back to where this story started. A Russian fighter jet, one of Moscow's most trusted air superiority platforms, went out over the Eastern Front doing exactly what it was built to do. It never made it home intact. Weeks later, thousands of miles away and half a world removed from that stretch of contested sky in a Senate hearing room, a four-star general confirmed in a handful of understated sentences what that loss actually meant. Not a lucky shot, not an isolated incident, a demonstrated capability, years in the making, now proven under real combat conditions, sitting behind a fleet of fighters that's only getting larger from here. Whatever Russia sends up next to hunt Ukrainian aircraft over that same stretch of front line is going up against a system that has already shown it knows exactly how to bring a fighter jet down before its own pilot ever gets close enough to see who's on the other end of the fight, and against an Air Force back home that, if the events near Moscow this same month are any indication, may struggle just as much to keep its own aircraft safe as it does to protect them from Ukraine.